It was a time of stark and sometimes startling contrasts in American life. World War I was over. Women got the right to vote. Fashion took a liberal turn. Alcohol was outlawed. Babe Ruth was king of the ballpark, Charles Lindbergh of the skies. Jazz filled the air and the airwaves, and just about everybody who could afford it went to the movies in the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties has the reputation as a decade of play and prosperity. Though unemployment was low and many Americans were better off financially, real wealth was concentrated among just a few families. 60% of America's riches were owned by only 2% of the people. The 27,500 wealthiest families had as much money as the 12 million poorest. With the end of World War I, the country desperately wanted to return to normal. But prices shot upward with the increased demand for goods and services, while wages were still low due to a ban on raises and labor strikes during the war. Now that the war had ended, strikes over higher wages resumed. In September 1919, Boston police walked off patrol, citing lousy pay and long hours. Their subsequent absence triggered a free-for-all of looters and vandals. In turn, city officials granted no negotiation. The police force was replaced without the option to return. That same month, 343,000 steel workers staged a nationwide strike, only to taste a violent defeat. When substitute workers were hired, rioting erupted, resulting in the mobilization of federal troops. 18 steel workers lost their lives in the struggle. The walkout lasted 4 months with no reward. As labor unrest spread across the country, some Americans felt it was being fostered by communists, radicals who believed in an economic and social system where prosperity is owned by everyone, and the needs of the whole are more important than those of the individual. Other citizens grew increasingly suspicious of immigrants, fearing they too might be communists. This so-called Red Scare was at a high during the presidential election of 1919, and Ohio Lieutenant Governor Warren G. Harding's campaign promise of a return to normalcy was just what the country wanted to hear and believe.
America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration.
Handsome, good-natured, and well-spoken, Harding and his running mate Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts easily defeated the Democratic ticket of James Cox and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Harding's proposal of a return to normalcy meant going back to pre-progressive era policies. He was opposed to the federal government's interference in business affairs and most social reforms. He rejected Woodrow Wilson's plea that America should actively participate in the League of Nations.
We seek no part in directing the destinies of the old world.
Harding's isolationist policy, keeping America out of world affairs, was popular, and his successors, Presidents Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, followed his lead through the decade. Harding's cabinet was filled with pro-business appointees, including Herbert Hoover, head of the Commerce Committee, Charles Evans Hughes, Secretary of State, and Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury. In 1923, he presented Congress his Mellon Plan, which on the surface sought a general reduction in income taxes. In fact, the plan cut the top income tax bracket level from 50% to 25%, while only reducing the lowest bracket from 4% to 3. Congressman William P. Connery of Massachusetts was outraged.
When I see a provision in this Mellon tax bill which is going to save Mr. Mellon himself $800,000 on his income tax and his brother $600,000 on his, I cannot give it my support.
Nevertheless, the Mellon plan passed, as did his proposal to raise tariffs on imported goods to one of the highest levels in history. Americans soon stopped buying foreign-made products, and that made it almost impossible for France and Great Britain to repay their war debts to the United States. Meanwhile, Secretary of Commerce Hoover aggressively helped American businesses recover from the war effort, while Secretary of State Hughes convinced the leading world powers to reduce the size of their navies. Despite these recoveries and Harding's popularity, by the end of his 3rd year, scandal rocked his administration. His old poker buddies from Ohio, whom he'd handed jobs in government, were caught taking bribes. Harding expressed his disappointment.
I have no trouble with my enemies, but my friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor nights.
The worst offense of the notorious Ohio gang involved Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall. During the Progressive Era, oil-rich public lands located in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hill, California, were set aside for use by the Navy. Fall transferred control of those lands to his Interior Department, and then secretly leased them to oil companies in exchange for $100,000 in bonds, cattle, and cash. By the summer of 1923, Harding, now saddened, confused, and disillusioned by the betrayal of his friends, left Washington for a goodwill trip to Alaska. Upon his return to San Francisco, he became ill and died on August 2nd.